She was 7 years old, barefoot, and bleeding in the middle of the Nevada desert, and the only people who stopped for her were the ones the whole world had been taught to fear. 3 bikers, black leather, engine grease under their fingernails, and old wars carved into their faces. The kind of men mothers pull their children away from at gas stations. But when little Wren Holloway collapsed at their boots and whispered those 7 words, "Please don't let them find my mama," something shifted in the desert heat. Something ancient. Something that couldn't be undone. Because the men the world calls dangerous? Sometimes they're the only ones left who know how to stand between a child and the dark. Stay until the end. If this story hits you, hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? The Nevada heat does something to silence. It stretches it, pulls it thin as wire until it hums against your skin, until the absence of sound becomes its own kind of pressure. Out on Route 93, somewhere between Caliente and nowhere, the heat had been doing that for 3 hours, and the only things breaking it were the occasional tick of cooling metal and the sound of a wrench finding purchase on a rusted bolt. Maddox Creed crouched beside his Road King with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that cursing at broken things only costs you breath. 51 years old. 6'2" of weathered muscle and old decisions. The back of his cut read Black Horizon MC in faded gold thread, the letters worn down by years of highway wind until they looked less like a declaration and more like a scar. His hands were enormous, though the kind that had built things, broken things, carried things that couldn't be carried. And right now, one of those hands was deep inside the primary chain cavity, while sweat ran a slow line down the side of his face and disappeared into the gray of his beard. 20 yards behind him, Silas Kane sat on an overturned plastic crate outside the husk of what had once been a roadside service station. The building had died sometime in the early 90s. Its windows were boarded with plywood that had warped and split in the heat, and one side of the roof had surrendered to gravity in a slow, undignified collapse. Silas wasn't looking at any of it. He was looking at his own hands, specifically at the way the left one trembled when he held it out flat. It had been doing that more lately. He didn't tell the others. He tucked the hand under his thigh and reached for his coffee thermos with the right one, and the trembling disappeared because it always did when there was something to hold on to. Silas was 44, former combat medic, 2 tours that he didn't talk about and one that he sometimes did in the way men talk about things that still have teeth, obliquely, at night, with enough whiskey to sand the edges down. He had a healer's face, which was the cruelest joke the world had played on him. Open, approachable. The kind of face that made frightened people lean toward him instead of away, which meant he had spent 20 years watching people die while leaning toward him, eyes asking him to fix what wasn't fixable. He was very good at the work. That was the other part of the joke. The third man wasn't sitting. Rhett Mercer stood at the far edge of the cracked asphalt where the lot met the dirt shoulder of the highway, and he was looking south. Just looking. He did that, stood and looked at distances the way other men looked at maps, like he was reading something in the empty land that wasn't visible to anyone else. Rhett was 38 and had the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable at close range. Not hostile stillness, not the coiled spring kind. The other kind, the stillness of a man who has been in enough situations where movement meant dying that his body had simply incorporated stillness as a default. He had served 6 years as an Army Ranger before the thing that ended it, the thing he called the incident, if anyone pressed, and which no one in the club ever did. His right shoulder sat slightly higher than his left, always had, since the incident. He'd never explained why, and Maddox had never asked. They had left Reno 2 days ago for a run down to Kingman, just the 3 of them, the kind of small party road trip that happened when the rest of the club had obligations, and these 3 had only each other and the highway. The Road King's primary chain had started giving trouble 40 miles back. Maddox had nursed it to this dead station on mechanical intuition and the kind of stubbornness that had kept him alive through things that should have finished him. 20 minutes, Maddox said without looking up. Silas checked the sky. The sun was beginning its late afternoon lean toward the western ridgeline, which in the desert meant the day's worst heat was past, but the night's emptiness was coming. No signal out here, he said. Not as a complaint, just an observation. Rhett said nothing. He was still looking south. Maddox worked. The chain was salvageable. Not good, not right, but writable to the next town if he set the tension correctly and didn't push past 60. He had done more with less. His mind was half on the mechanical problem and half on the same low-grade hum of worry that had followed him out of Reno. A letter from a lawyer he didn't know about property taxes on land he'd inherited from his father that he'd never done anything with. The letter had been sitting on his kitchen table for 6 days. He hadn't opened it yet. He knew what kind of letters came from lawyers he didn't know, and he wasn't ready for that conversation with himself. He was still not ready when Rhett said, quietly, Maddox. One word. But Rhett Mercer used words the way other men used emergency flares, only when something needed to be seen immediately. Maddox set the wrench down and stood. She was maybe 100 yards out, coming from the south, coming from the direction of nothing. A small shape against the enormous backdrop of desert scrub and heat shimmer, moving in the unsteady way of something that had been moving for a very long time and was using the last of what it had. Even at that distance, you could tell she was a child. Even at that distance, you could tell something was wrong. None of them moved for a moment, not from indifference, from training, from the understanding that sometimes the terrible thing you were looking at was not the only terrible thing, and sometimes the child in the desert is the thing they send first to see if anyone is there. But Silas was already moving, because Silas always moved toward the hurt thing regardless of what came after. And that was both his greatest quality and the thing that had cost him the most over the course of his life. She collapsed at 30 yards. Just went down. Knees first, then sideways, catching herself on one arm and letting out a sound that traveled across the hot asphalt in a way that sounds don't usually travel, clear and small and devastating in its smallness. Silas was running. Maddox was walking fast, which for Maddox covered the same ground. Rhett turned from his position at the lot's edge and angled toward them without hurry, scanning the desert behind the girl as he came. That ranger habit of checking the terrain before giving your full attention to the thing in front of you. She was 7, maybe 8. Brown hair matted with dirt and something darker that Silas clocked immediately as dried blood from a laceration above her ear. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt that had once had something printed on it, worn down now to just a ghost of color. No shoes. Her feet were in a condition that told a story of distance covered over unforgiving ground, cracked, bleeding in multiple small places, the kind of damage that accumulated over miles, not minutes. Her right arm was held close to her body at an angle that made Silas's chest tighten because he knew what that angle meant. He dropped to a knee beside her. She flinched back from him with an animal speed that broke something in the air between them. "Hey," he said. His voice had dropped to the register he'd found by accident during his second tour, talking to people in the wreckage of things. Low and even and entirely without urgency, even when urgency was roaring through every cell in his body. "I'm not going to grab you. You're okay." She was staring at him with eyes that had the specific quality of eyes that had stopped expecting anything good from the world and were simply processing data. Threat, non-threat, degrees of danger. They were dark eyes. They moved from Silas to Maddox, who had stopped 4 feet away and was crouching to reduce his size, and then to Rhett, who had positioned himself slightly behind and to the left and was still watching the desert. "My name is Silas," Silas said. "What's yours?" "Nothing." Her breath was shallow and quick. "You've come a long way," he said. "Your feet tell me that. You're very tough to have walked this far. Can you tell me where you came from?" Her eyes went back to the desert she'd come from. Something moved through her face. Not fear exactly. Fear was the wrong word for it. Fear was what you felt when the bad thing might happen. What moved through her face was what you felt when the bad thing had already been happening for a long time and was still happening, and the only question was whether it would find you here too. She looked at Maddox, at his cut, at the black horizon patch, at the size of him. Then she said it. 7 words, barely above a whisper, in a voice scraped raw from whatever she'd been through. "Please don't let them find my mama." The desert absorbed the words the way it absorbed everything, without comment, without comfort. The heat kept pressing. A lizard moved somewhere in the brush with a sound like paper. Maddox held the girl's gaze for a moment. Then he said to Silas, without looking away from her, "What's she got?" "Right arm. Possible fracture at the radius. Head lack. Needs cleaning. Feet are cut up. Dehydrated." Silas was already opening the small trauma bag he kept lashed to his bike like a habit from another life. "She needs water first." "We've got water," Maddox said, and now he was talking to the girl. "We're going to give you some. Nobody's going to touch you unless you say it's okay. You understand?" She didn't answer, but she didn't pull back. Rhett returned from the lot's edge. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Road's empty both directions. No dust south." He looked at the girl's feet, at the distance she'd crossed, and something moved through his face that he immediately put away. She didn't walk here from any road. Silas gave her water, and she took it, carefully at first, then with the desperate urgency of real thirst, and he had to slow her down because the stomach cramps from drinking too fast after dehydration were a different kind of terrible. While she drank, he examined her arm with the gentle precision of 2 decades of field medicine, and he was careful not to let his expression change when he confirmed what he'd suspected. The radius was cracked, not fully broken, but it needed to be immobilized, and it needed to be looked at by someone with equipment he didn't have strapped to his motorcycle. "What's your name?" Maddox asked again, same tone. Not demanding, asking. She looked at him over the water bottle. "Ren." "Ren." He said it like he was committing it. "Okay, Ren. I'm Maddox. The one fixing your arm is Silas, and the quiet one is Rhett, and none of us are going to hurt you." He paused. "Is your mama hurt?" Something behind her eyes fractured, just slightly. The way ice shifts on water. You can't hear it, but you can feel the whole surface change. "I don't know," she whispered. "He took her." Maddox looked at Silas. Silas looked at the girl. "Who took her, Ren?" Silas asked. "Calvin." She said the name like it tasted bad. "He said she owed money. He said if she didn't do what he said..." She stopped, swallowed, started over. "He makes people scared. That's what he does. He comes and he makes people scared until they do what he wants." Rhett had moved to stand closer, not looming over her, but present in a way that meant he was listening with his whole body. He looked at Maddox. Maddox rubbed the back of his neck. 20 minutes ago, his biggest problem was a chain with wrong tension and an unopened letter from a lawyer he didn't know. Now there was a 7-year-old girl in the dirt with a cracked radius and blood in her hair, and a story about a man named Calvin who made people scared, and somewhere in whatever direction she'd come from, a mother. He had 2 choices. Both of them were clear. He had always been a man who knew his choices clearly, even when neither of them was good. "Silas," he said, "how mobile is she?" "For what?" "For the bike." Silas thought about the arm, about the dehydration, about the cuts on her feet. "If we rig a sling and she rides in front of you, controlled speed, yeah, she can make it." "What's the next town with a clinic?" Maddox asked. "Pioche," Rhett said. 42 miles. There's a retired ER doc out there. Walcott. I know him." Maddox looked at Ren. "We're going to take you to a doctor," he said. "Get your arm fixed and get you somewhere safe, okay? And then you're going to tell us everything you know about Calvin. Can you do that?" She looked at him for a long moment. The same evaluating look, processing, measuring, checking against some internal ledger she'd been keeping since whatever had happened to her had started happening. Then she nodded. Maddox stood and walked back to his bike and resumed his work on the primary chain, and now he worked faster, his big hands moving with new purpose. Silas fashioned a sling from a strip of cloth from his bag and talked Ren through it with quiet, patient instructions. Rhett stood at the lot's edge again, but now he was watching north as well as south, and his right hand had drifted closer to his side in a way that Maddox noticed and filed. The chain was tightened. The bike would make 42 miles. Maddox mounted, felt the engine come up under him. That familiar low rumble, the vibration that traveled from the frame through his thighs and his spine and settled somewhere in his chest where his anxiety usually lived, replacing it, the way it always did, with something simpler and more manageable. Purpose. Motion. The knowledge that the next thing to do was clear. He looked at the girl, who Silas had helped to her feet and was guiding gently toward the Road King. You're going to hold onto the tank with your good arm, Maddox told her. I go slow. If you need to stop, you tap my leg, okay? Don't try to be tough about it. Wren looked up at him from the shadow of his bike. Are you going to find her? She said. My mama. Maddox looked down at her. At the blood in her hair and the dirt on her yellow shirt and the ancient, exhausted determination in her 7-year-old eyes. Let's get you fixed up first, he said. It wasn't no. And she was smart enough to know that. They rode north toward Pioche in single file. Silas leading, Rhett trailing, Maddox in the middle with Wren braced against the tank and the desert opening ahead of them in shades of orange and violet as the sun went lower. The Road King ran rough but true. The wind came up the way Nevada wind comes up at dusk. Sudden and cold and smelling of nothing, of vast open space, of distance without end. Wren held on with her good arm and didn't make a sound. And the not making a sound cost her. Maddox could feel it in the slight tremor against his chest and the way she kept her face forward into the wind, eyes open, jaw set. Tough kid, he thought. Terrible word for what she was. The kind of tough you got from being let down enough times that you stopped expecting the letdown to ever end. He knew that kind. He'd been that kind. The town lights of Pioche appeared on the horizon at dusk, and Maddox was deciding how to find Walcott's place when his phone found signal for the first time in 4 hours and buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words. We know her. He read it twice, slowed his speed without thinking about it, looked in his mirror at Rhett, who was watching him, who had somehow already clocked that something had changed because Rhett always clocked when something changed. Maddox looked at the road ahead, at the small shape of Wren on his tank, holding on with everything she had. His thumb moved to his phone, and he was halfway through typing. Who is this when the second message arrived? Bring her back, or the mother pays for it. The Road King's engine rumbled low beneath him, and the desert wind moved cold across his face, and the town lights of Pioche were close now, but Maddox Creed felt the distance between here and safety open into something that had no measurable end. Because whoever Calvin was, he already knew where they were headed. Maddox read the message a 3rd time. Not because he didn't understand it, because he was giving himself 3 seconds to decide what kind of man he was going to be in the next 24 hours, and 3 seconds was all the time the situation was offering. He downshifted without braking, keeping the deceleration smooth so Wren wouldn't feel the change, and he tapped twice on his left thigh, the signal, old between them and unspoken, that meant close formation. In his mirror, he saw Rhett react instantly, rolling up to within 6 feet of his rear wheel. Silas, up front, must have caught something in his peripheral because he slowed fractionally to tighten the gap. 3 bikes, 1 child, 1 message from a number that knew their direction of travel, which meant either they'd been followed from the abandoned station, and Rhett had checked for following vehicles, and Rhett did not miss following vehicles, or Calvin's people had infrastructure out here. Contacts. A network of eyes on the roads between nowhere and the next town that a 7-year-old girl might reasonably be headed toward. Neither possibility made Maddox feel better about the lights of Pioche ahead of them. He pocketed the phone and rode. Doc Walcott lived on the north edge of Pioche in a single-story ranch house that had been retrofitted with better lighting than it deserved, the kind of surgical-grade fluorescence that told you the man inside still used the space for work, even if he no longer called it a clinic. The gravel driveway was unlocked, the porch light was on. Rhett had called ahead from the highway when the signal returned, and whatever he'd said had been enough, because the door was already open when they rolled in. Walcott was 60-something, lean, with the specific economy of movement that belonged to men who had spent decades making decisions in rooms where every second cost something. He looked at Wren, and he looked at the 3 bikers behind her with the same flat professional assessment, and whatever judgment he carried about men in cuts he kept behind his teeth. In here, he said. Wren went with him, because Silas went with her, and because by now she'd decided Silas was safe in the specific way that children decided things. Not through reasoning, but through some older process that adults spent their whole lives trying to reconnect to. Maddox and Rhett stayed in the front room. It was a room that had been a living room once and still pretended to be. A couch, a side table, a lamp throwing amber light. But the medical supply cabinet visible through the half-open hallway door told the truth. Maddox stood at the window looking at the driveway and the street beyond it. Nothing moved. Pioche was a small town doing small-town evening things. A dog barking 2 streets over, the distant sound of a television, the smell of someone's dinner reaching them even through the closed window. Rhett sat on the edge of the couch and didn't touch anything and looked at the middle distance. "How many people know we came this way?" Maddox asked. "Nobody I told. I didn't tell anybody." "Then either we've got a tail I didn't see," Rhett said, "or whoever sent that message has a contact between Caliente and here watching for specific things." He paused. "A child on a bike with 3 club riders would be specific." "Gas stations. Intersections." Maddox's jaw tightened. "Traffic cameras, if there are any, but there aren't on 93, so somebody watching the roads. Or somebody watching us before the station." Rhett's voice was careful, flat, giving the words room to land without commentary. "Somebody who knew where we were riding." The room got quieter than it had been. Maddox turned from the window. He looked at Rhett for a moment. The specific look between men who have known each other through enough that a look can carry the weight of a conversation neither of them wants to have out loud. "That's a serious thing to suggest," Maddox said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Rhett said. "I'm mapping the possibilities." "Map them somewhere else for now." Rhett nodded once, slowly. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. The distinction mattered. From down the hall came the small, controlled sound of Wren and Walcott and Silas, the sound of something being managed. Maddox stood at the window and watched the driveway and tried to think clearly, which was harder than it should have been because every time he thought about the message, "Bring her back or the mother pays for it," he thought about the girl's voice in the desert, the 7 words, the way she'd said mama the way children say it when it means everything, when it means the one specific person who makes the rest of the world survivable. He had not had that person since he was 12 years old. He knew what it cost to lose them. He was not going to let that happen to Wren. The decision wasn't complicated. It never was, for Maddox. The complicated part was everything that came after. Silas came out 20 minutes later. He pulled the door half closed behind him, crossed his arms, and stood in the hallway with the look on his face that Maddox recognized from the field. The look of a man who has just finished one problem and is about to deliver the accounting of it. Arms splinted, hairline at the distal radius. It'll need imaging and probably a proper cast in the next 48 hours, but it won't worsen in the short term if she doesn't use it. Hedelac needed 4 sutures. She's got some soft tissue bruising on her ribs that Walcott thinks is maybe 3 days old. He paused. "Defensive injuries." "Someone grabbed her. Hard." The words sat in the room. "How old are the feet injuries?" Red asked. "Hours. She walked this after the ribs." Maddox absorbed this. A 7-year-old with 3-day-old bruising from being grabbed and grabbed hard, who had then walked barefoot across Nevada desert hardpan to find what? Help. The word felt inadequate. She hadn't been looking for help in the abstract. She'd been looking for something between her mother and the man named Calvin, and the only things she'd found on that highway were 3 bikers at a dead service station. "She talked to you?" Maddox asked. "Some. Walcott gave her something mild for pain, and she got drowsy, but before that..." Silas unfolded his arms, ran a hand across his jaw. He had a habit of that when he was sorting information, as if the gesture helped organize the intake. "Her mother's name is Evelyn Holloway. They live on a property about 16 miles southeast of Caliente. She gave me directions that were surprisingly detailed for a 7-year-old, landmarks, fence lines, a dry creek bed. The mother's been dealing with someone pressuring her about the property for months. Wren says Calvin shows up with men, and her mama gets very quiet and scared, and after they leave, she cries but pretends she wasn't." "What do they want the property for?" Red asked. "Wren doesn't know. She knows they want the land. She knows the word debt because she's heard it enough. And she knows that about 4 days ago, something different happened. Calvin came with more men, and her mama told her to run. Told her to find the highway and find someone." Silas stopped. "She said her mama made her memorize a number, a phone number. Said if she found anyone safe, call it. She lost the number when they grabbed her. That's where the rib bruising came from. They caught up to her and took the paper, and she got away from them in the dark." "The dark," Maddox said. "So they had her. They had her, and she escaped." "Yeah." which means Calvin already knows she's out there. He wasn't looking for her. He knew she was loose. The silence that followed had texture to it, rough texture, the kind that accumulated when everyone in a room was doing the same math and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. The text wasn't a threat, Rhett said quietly. It was a test. He wanted to know who she'd found. Maddox pulled the phone out and looked at it. The number was still on the screen. Unknown, no area code identifier that matched anything regional. He was not an IT man. He knew enough to know that tracing it himself was not happening. What he knew how to do was think about what the message told him. The Calvin had resources, communication infrastructure in a rural corridor, and enough confidence to make contact with strangers who'd picked up his loose end. That confidence was a data point. Men with that kind of confidence didn't work alone. They worked inside something larger that made them feel protected. "Show me," Rhett said, extending his hand. Maddox gave him the phone. Rhett looked at the number for a long moment with the same expression he'd had watching the desert horizon, reading distance. Then he took out his own phone and typed the number into a search, with the careful two-finger deliberateness of a man who had not grown up with the technology. Nothing came back. He tried a different approach, a different search. Still nothing. "Clean number," he said. "Prepaid or spoofed. So we can't ping it back." "Not us. No." Maddox took his phone back and put it in his pocket and stood with his hands loose at his sides, thinking. In the room down the hall, Wren was probably asleep by now. Small and splinted and stitched and finally, temporarily, out of the desert that had nearly taken her. Walcott would keep her through the night. He'd said as much without being asked, because Walcott was that kind of man, the kind who closed the curtains and didn't make calls about things that weren't his business. "We need Decker," Maddox said. Rhett's expression shifted by approximately nothing. "That's a call." "I know it's a call. Last time you and Decker talked, I know what the last time was." Rhett let it rest. Decker Voss had been Black Horizon's vice president for 6 years before the falling out 3 years ago. Not a clean falling out, not the kind where both men shake hands and agree their time together was good, but the kind that left load-bearing silences in a room whenever someone mentioned the name. Maddox had never fully explained to Silas what had happened, and Silas had never fully asked, which was its own kind of understanding. What Maddox knew, and what mattered tonight, was that Decker had a contact in Las Vegas Metro who did things with data that were technically legal if you held them in certain light, and right now Maddox needed someone to shine certain light on a man named Calvin and a debt collection operation that used its muscle in the Nevada desert. He stepped outside to make the call. The night had come down hard and cold, the way desert nights did. No warning, no transition, just the full weight of elevation and clear sky, dropping the temperature 25 degrees in an hour. His breath showed. He stood by his bike with one hand resting on the tank, warm metal under his palm from the day's riding, and he dialed. 4 rings. 5. He was calculating what message to leave when the line connected and Decker said nothing, just the sound of his breathing and whatever room he was in. "It's Maddox," Maddox said. More silence. Then, "I know who it is. I need something." "Of course you do." No heat in it. No ice either. The specific neutral of a man who had decided he wasn't going to be surprised by anything. "I've got a name. Calvin. Operates debt collection, I think. Muscle and intimidation variety, rural Nevada, Caliente corridor. Targeting properties. I need to know who he answers to and what the operation looks like." Breathing on the line, Maddox could hear Decker thinking, the slight shift in the sound that he'd learned to read over the years they'd ridden together, the years before. "Why?" Decker said. "A kid ended up in the desert. Her mother's missing." Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you in it, or are you trying to get in it?" "I'm already in it." "Yeah." Something changed in Decker's voice. Not warmth exactly. More like the particular resignation of a man who had known another man long enough to know how his stories ended. "Send me what you've got. Calvin, property area, anything else." "There's a phone number." Maddox read it out. "I'll have something by morning." "Maddox." A pause. This going to put you somewhere difficult? Maddox looked up at the stars, clear and brutally numerous out here, where the light pollution ended. Probably, he said. Okay, Decker said, and ended the call. Silas was on the porch when Maddox turned back. He'd acquired a cigarette from somewhere. He kept a pack in his bag for the occasions when the weight of things got specific enough to require one, and he was treating the cigarette with the respectful economy of a man who didn't smoke often enough to have it be automatic. He offered the pack. Maddox took one. They smoked without talking for a minute, which between them was a form of conversation. She asked about her mother again before she went under, Silas said. What did you tell her? That we were working on it. He drew on the cigarette. Is that the truth? Maddox exhaled. Yes. Silas nodded. He looked at the street, at the empty quiet of Pioche at night. I've been thinking about the property angle, he said. Caliente Corridor has been getting land grab for the last few years. I've read about it. Water rights, mostly. There's aquifer access under some of that desert that the new utility projects need. And the old families that own those parcels mostly don't know what they're sitting on. He paused. If Evelyn Holloway's land has water rights attached, somebody with real money behind them would pay a lot to make sure she loses it under pressure. Maddox looked at him. How long have you been thinking about this? Since Wren said the word debt. It's not the right word for a kid who grew up in a property dispute to use. She learned that word the way she said it. It's the word Calvin uses. It's his framing. That's what the operation tells people they have. A debt. Then they manufacture the paperwork to prove it. So Calvin's not the top of it. Calvin is the boots on the ground, Silas said. The man who comes to the door and makes people scared, which means somebody is paying Calvin. And the money for that kind of sustained rural operation isn't small county money. It's somebody with reach. Maddox stared at the gravel driveway. His cigarette had burned down to almost nothing, and he took a last pull and crushed it under his boot. Decker's pulling the number and the name. Silas absorbed this without comment on the Decker part of it. He was good at that, knowing which information was being offered and which was being withheld, and having the patience not to go after the withheld parts. There's something else, Silas said. Maddox waited. Wren mentioned the number her mother gave her to memorize. Silas reached into his cut and produced a folded napkin. I had her draw the digits she remembered. She got 7 of them before the sedative took her. He handed the napkin over. Maddox looked at the 7 child-drawn digits, a partial number. Not enough to call, but enough to recognize the exchange if he saw the full version. He looked at it for a long moment. Then something went through him. Not quite recognition, more like its precursor, the sensation of something familiar approaching from a direction you weren't watching. The exchange prefix. He knew it. He'd seen it on documents, years ago, not recently, before the club, before Nevada even. He couldn't place it precisely, but it was there, in the back of his memory, attached to something he hadn't thought about in a very long time. He folded the napkin and put it in his chest pocket. Get some sleep if you can, he told Silas. I want to move before dawn. Where are we going? Back toward Caliente, 16 miles southeast. He looked at Silas. She gave you fence lines and a dry creek bed. Silas studied him. You're going to the property. I'm going to find out what's on it and what happened there. And if Evelyn Holloway is somewhere near it, I want to know that too. And Wren stays here. Wren stays here. Walcott doesn't let anyone in he doesn't know, and you don't leave her. Something moved through Silas's expression. You're taking Rhett. Yes. Maddox. Silas kept his voice even, but the evenness was doing work. You and Rhett going into a rural property in the dark where a woman has been taken by an operation that already knows your name and your direction of travel. That's a 2-man team going into something designed for more. I know what it is. Then you know it's the kind of thing we'd normally bring a full club for. I know that too. Maddox held his gaze. But I don't know who in the club told them where we were riding. The words landed and stayed. Silas looked at him steadily. His cigarette had gone out, and he held the dead end of it and said nothing for a moment. Then, You're sure about that? That it came from inside? No, I'm not sure. But I'm not moving until I'm closer to sure, and I can't get closer to sure with the full club until I understand what this is. Maddox's voice was quiet and flat and entirely without drama, which made it worse. I've put 23 years into that brotherhood. I'm not burning it down on a suspicion, but I'm also not putting Wren back in front of Calvin while I sort it out. Silas stood with that for a moment. Then he nodded, a slow, reluctant nod that meant he understood, even if he didn't like the understanding. "Be careful," he said. It was not the kind of thing he said easily. "Always," Maddox said, which was not quite the truth, but was close enough for this particular night. He and Rhett left Pioche at 2 in the morning, running dark on a back road south that Rhett knew from memory. No headlights, because the desert at 2 in the morning had enough starlight for men who knew how to use it, and because headlights on an empty road announced position in a way that wasn't useful when you didn't know who was watching. They found the dry creek bed from Wren's directions. The girl had been right, she had precision in her, and they left the bikes behind a stand of scrub juniper and went the last half-mile on foot. Rhett moved like he was part of the landscape, each step placed with the deliberate quietness of deep training, and Maddox stayed in his footprints because there was no shame in following someone better at this particular thing. The property was dark when they reached it. A single-story house, a small outbuilding, a water cistern at the east end. The house showed signs of recent occupation. A coffee mug still on the porch rail, a child's shoe near the front step, a window left open on the west side. But Evelyn Holloway was not there. The house was empty in the way houses were empty when people had been removed from them suddenly and not by their own choice. Things left mid-use, a pot on the stove with something dried in the bottom, a chair pushed back from the table at an angle that said someone had stood up fast. Rhett went through the outbuilding while Maddox went through the house. He moved quickly and carefully, not touching more than he had to. In the bedroom, he found a shoebox under the bed that Evelyn had clearly used as a file box. Papers, receipts, letters, and envelopes that had been opened and refolded many times. He took them. In the kitchen, he found a notepad beside the landline phone with impressions on the top sheet. A number pressed through from the sheet above. He took the notepad. He was in the kitchen when Rhett appeared at the back door. His face in the darkness was composed, but composed in the specific way that meant he had found something. "Outbuilding," Rhett said. "You need to see it." What Rhett had found in the outbuilding was a filing cabinet, locked, but the lock was the kind designed to keep casual hands out rather than determined ones, and Rhett was not casual. Inside were documents, not Evelyn's documents, someone else's. Printed correspondence, records, names and property parcel numbers, maps with parcels highlighted in yellow, dozens of properties. Not just Evelyn's land. Land across the corridor, Lincoln County and beyond. A pattern of acquisition that went back 5 years. All processed through a company whose header Maddox read at the top of the first document and then read again to be certain. Meridian Asset Recovery. A Las Vegas address. An executive name at the bottom of the formal correspondence. Not Calvin. Calvin's name appeared in the middle of the chain as a field supervisor. Above him, several layers of management, and above them all, a signature on the most recent letter that Maddox stared at for a long time under the thin beam of his pocket light. Gideon Vale. The name meant nothing to him immediately. Then it did. Slowly, the way things came back that you'd pushed down. A profile piece he'd read years ago in a business magazine left in a waiting room somewhere. A real estate developer with Nevada interests. The kind of man who appeared at ribbon cuttings and smiled in photographs, and whose name appeared on buildings, and whose actual business was conducted far enough below the surface of those photographs that you'd need equipment. Maddox didn't have to reach it. He photographed every document with his phone. Then he photographed them again to be sure. He was zipping the last photographs when he found the one that made him stop. It was a property assessment, standard format. Parcel number, acreage, adjacent properties, access notes. He'd been through 30 of them by now, and his eyes had stopped reading every word. But the parcel number caught him. He knew that number, not from professional familiarity, from the letter. The unopened letter sitting on his kitchen table in Reno. The letter from the lawyer he didn't know. His parcel number. His father's land. It was on the list. Maddox stood in the dark outbuilding with the document in his hands and the pocket light throwing harsh shadows and the desert silence pressing in through the walls. And he understood several things at once in the way understanding sometimes arrived, not sequentially but all together, a full picture arriving in a single frame. He was not collateral. He was not accidentally adjacent to this. Gideon Vale's operation had put him on a list. His land, 47 acres of high desert north of Caliente, that his father had left him and that he'd never developed and hadn't thought about in years, was on the same acquisition list as Evelyn Holloway's property. The letter on his kitchen table wasn't a routine tax notice. It was the first move, and they'd had eyes on him long enough to know his route, his club, his brothers on this ride. Because if you were going to acquire a property from a man like Maddox Creed, you didn't just send Calvin to the door. You watched first. You mapped the vulnerabilities. You learned what he cared about. You waited for a child to stumble into his path. The thought arrived, and he pushed it back immediately, because it was the kind of thought that, if you followed it all the way down, turned into paranoia, and he needed not to be paranoid right now. He needed to be clear. But the thought didn't fully leave. He stepped out of the outbuilding. Rhett was at the property's south fence line, looking toward the road. The night was very still. Somewhere in the middle distance, a vehicle engine idled, not moving, not coming closer, just idling, like someone had parked out on the access road and was waiting to see if anyone would come out of the property. Rhett looked at him. His hand was at his side again. Maddox looked back at the house, at the open window, at the child's shoe by the front step, at the coffee mug on the porch rail that Evelyn Holloway had left there when her day was still ordinary before Calvin came and made the day into something else. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number, different from the first one, different prefix. His chest went tight. He opened it. A photograph. Low resolution, taken in low light. A woman, dark-haired, mid-30s, the exhausted dignity of someone trying to hold themselves together under conditions that made it very hard. She was sitting against a concrete wall with her hands restrained and her eyes open, looking at the camera with an expression that had stopped asking why and was simply enduring. Beneath the photograph, 2 lines of text. She's been very patient. How patient are you? And then, we know about Reno, we know the compound, we know all 23 of your brothers. The idling engine on the access road revved once, softly, like a reminder, and then went quiet. And Maddox Creed stood in the Nevada dark with his father's land on a predator's list and a child's mother on a concrete floor, and the first cold edge of something he hadn't felt in years pressing against the back of his throat. Not fear. The thing that came before fear in men like him. The recognition that this had never been about Ren at all. This had been about him from the beginning. And whoever Gideon Vale was, he had been patient enough to wait until a 7-year-old girl walking out of the desert made the trap close perfectly. Maddox did not move for 11 seconds. He counted them without meaning to, an old habit from situations where moving wrong cost more than moving slow. And in those 11 seconds, he did the following things. He looked at the photograph again. He looked at the access road where the engine had been idling. He looked at Rhett, and he looked at the sky, which was the same sky it had always been, and offered nothing. Then he moved. "We're leaving," he said, voice just above the desert floor's ambient silence. "South fence. Now." Rhett was already moving. He had read the shift in Maddox's posture the way he read everything, but not through the words, but through the body, the angle of the shoulders, the quality of the stillness that preceded the words. And whatever he read had made him go quiet and deliberate in a way that meant he understood the level had changed. They went back through the scrub juniper the way they'd come, staying below the property's sight lines. Maddox kept the photograph on his phone screen as he walked, not because he needed to look at it again, but because he was afraid that if he closed it, the image would settle somewhere in his chest and become the kind of weight that slowed a man down at the wrong moment. He needed to keep it external. Evelyn Holloway on a concrete floor, eyes open, enduring. He closed it. He had to. The bikes were where they'd left them. Maddox stood with his hands on his handlebars and felt the cold of the metal and breathed, 1 breath, 2, the kind of controlled intake that reset the system, that put the brain back in front of the body. He'd learned it from a VA counselor he'd seen exactly twice before deciding the VA was not going to fix what was broken in him. The breathing had been the one thing worth keeping. They sent another message, he said. I figured. Rhett was checking the perimeter by feel and sound rather than sight, his head slightly tilted, using his ears. They know about the compound. They named the count. Rhett went very still. 23. Yes. The number hung in the cold air. 23 brothers. Men who trusted Maddox Creed because he'd spent 20 years being the kind of president worth trusting. Men who were in Reno right now, asleep, or working, or at the bar, or in bed with their families, entirely unaware that someone had been cataloging them. And my land is on Vale's acquisition list, Maddox said. He said it quietly, matter-of-factly, because that was the only way to say a thing like that without it becoming a different kind of problem. The property from my father. It's parcel numbered in the documents we found. Rhett looked at him. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. The particular shift of a man recalibrating, adjusting his model of the situation to accommodate a new and significant variable. How long has the list been running? Rhett asked. Documents go back 5 years. Rhett absorbed this. So Vale has been building toward this for 5 years. That's not opportunistic. That's structural. Yes. And you just landed in the middle of it. Or was walked into it, Maddox said. He kept his voice even. That's the part I don't have yet. They rode back to Pioche in the dark, and Maddox spent the 42 miles turning the thing over in his mind the way you turned a stone, looking for what was underneath, for the soft, damp evidence of how long it had been sitting. 5 years. What had he been doing 5 years ago? What had changed? Who had access to his route information for this run? Who knew his father's land existed? Who knew his parcel number and his property history and the size of his club? The answer to the last question was anyone who'd been in Black Horizon for more than a decade. He rode faster. Silas met them at the door of Walcott's house before they'd finished parking, which meant he'd been watching from the window, which meant he hadn't slept. She's okay, he said immediately, reading the question on Maddox's face. Still out. Walcott's in the back. What happened? Maddox pushed past him into the kitchen. The fluorescent light above the sink was the only light on, and it was the harsh clinical kind that made everything look like evidence. He spread the photograph documents on the kitchen table, printed now from the small portable unit Walcott kept in his office that Maddox had used without asking. And he walked Silas through it in 12 minutes flat, keeping his voice level, leaving nothing out, including the part about his own land and the part about the 23 brothers. Silas listened. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving across the documents as Maddox talked. And his face did the thing it did when he was absorbing information that required immediate action but hadn't yet been sorted into categories. Everything held just below the surface, controlled but clearly pressured. When Maddox finished, Silas was quiet for a moment. The phone number that Evelyn made Wren memorize, he said. The partial one. I have it. Maddox handed him the napkin. Silas looked at it. Then he looked at the notepad Maddox had taken from Evelyn's kitchen, the impressions page. Maddox had been carrying both without connecting them, the way you carried things when you were moving too fast to be careful, and now he watched Silas hold them side by side under the kitchen light and go very still. What? Maddox said. The exchange prefix. Silas looked up. The one on the notepad, the one Wren remembered. Maddox looked. The prefix on the notepad impression matched the 7 digits on the napkin. Same exchange. The number Evelyn had pressed Wren to memorize and the number she'd written on a notepad in her kitchen were the same number. So she was calling that number, Maddox said. Before Calvin came. Who was she calling? The question sat in the kitchen under the fluorescent light. Rhett, who had been standing in the doorway, came in and looked at the notepad and the napkin and at the documents. He picked up one of the property assessment sheets and looked at it, put it down, picked up another. His reading was slow and methodical, and the other two waited because when Rhett was looking at something with that quality of attention, he was seeing something worth waiting for. Maddox, he said. Yeah. The assessor's signature on your parcel. He set the document down and pointed to a signature at the bottom. A county assessor's notation. Routine, bureaucratic, the kind of thing you'd look at and look away from. I've seen this signature. Maddox looked. Whose is it? I don't know the name, Rhett said carefully. I've seen the signature. In the compound. He paused. On the wall in the back office. On the photographs. The compound's back office had photographs on one wall. Not decoration. History. Men from the club's early days. Events. A documented past that Maddox had been part of building. Which photograph? Maddox said. Rhett looked at him steadily. The one from the Laughlin Run, 12 years ago. Maddox's mind moved backward through 12 years with the specific reluctance of a mind that knew it wasn't going to like where it arrived. The Laughlin Run. He knew the photograph. He could see it. A group shot, a motel parking lot, 10 men in cuts, the Nevada morning behind them. He went through the faces, and he went through the names, and he held each one up against the signature on the property document, and when he arrived at the right one, he felt it the way you felt a punch that you'd seen coming but couldn't move out of the way of. The knowledge was already in your body before your brain confirmed it. Decker, he said. The word was quiet. Almost nothing. Just breath shaped into a name. Silas looked at him sharply. Rhett said nothing, and his expression said nothing, and his nothing was the loudest thing in the room. Maddox picked up the document, looked at the signature, the initials, DV. He'd always read Decker's signature as a cursive shorthand, the D and the V compressed, Decker Voss. But DV could also be an assessor's notation, a professional identifier. And Decker had worked county government before the club, briefly, in a period Maddox had never examined closely because men came to Black Horizon from all kinds of before, and you didn't interrogate the before. I called him tonight, Maddox said. I know, Silas said. His voice was careful. Not accusatory, just very careful. I gave him the phone number, Calvin's number. I know. And I told him where we were riding, that we were headed for Kingman. He stopped. He looked at his phone, at the call log, at the timestamp, 8:53 p.m. And then he looked at the first message from the unknown number, 9:14 p.m., 21 minutes after he'd told Decker their heading. His hand tightened on the phone. It might not be him, Silas said, because Silas was the kind of man who made himself say the hard other thing even when the evidence was moving in one direction. The signature could be coincidence. The timing, Silas. Could be coincidence. Silas. Maddox looked at him, not angry. Something worse than angry. Settled. The particular stillness of a man who has been through enough betrayal to recognize its shape from a distance and is now watching it come toward him and deciding not to look away. 21 minutes. Silas closed his mouth. He looked at the table. Rhett walked to the window and stood with his back to them and his arms crossed, and the set of his shoulders said everything his voice wasn't saying, that he had always been somewhat less trusting of Decker than Maddox had been, and that he was not going to say so now, because now was not the time to be right. The kitchen clock read 4:17 a.m. Maddox sat down at the table. He hadn't sat down in hours, and the chair under him felt like an accusation. All the sitting he could have done while making better decisions, or the same decisions more slowly, or decisions that didn't involve calling Decker Voss at 9 p.m. and handing him the thread that led directly back here. He sat for 90 seconds. Then he stood. We need to move Wren, he said. Walcott's place is clean, Silas said. Decker knows we came to Pioche. He knows Walcott. He's been in this club for 14 years. He's heard every name I've mentioned in proximity to this town. Maddox was already moving toward the hallway. We have maybe until morning before someone shows up here with the assumption that this is where we took her. We need to be gone before then. Gone to where? Silas asked. I'm working on it. Maddox. Silas's voice carried something in it that stopped him. Not the word, the quality of it. The weight of a man who was choosing to say something he'd been not saying. If Decker is inside Vale's operation, then Vale has had years of club information. Routes, contacts, property. Your property. He paused. He might also know about the compound's location, the road approaches, the security setup. If Vale decides that the response to you going rogue on this is to stop being subtle, Then 23 people I'm responsible for are at risk, Maddox said. Yes, I've thought about that. Have you thought about the fact that calling the compound to warn them might also warn Decker that you figured it out? The hallway was very narrow, and the light was very harsh, and Maddox Creed stood in it with that thought and did the work of holding it. Who in the compound do we trust completely, he said, without going through Decker? Silas didn't hesitate. Boone. Hector Boone Barajas, Sergeant-at-Arms, 13 years in. The man who had stood beside Maddox at 3 different situations that had required standing and had never once made it about anything other than what it needed to be about. Boone, Maddox said. Okay, you call him. Don't say Decker's name. Tell him there's a threat to the compound that's credible and recent, and to quietly set a security posture without making it a conversation, especially not with the VP. Silas nodded and took out his phone. Maddox went to Wren. She was asleep on a narrow examination table that Walcott had made up with a folded blanket, her splinted arm across her stomach, her face in sleep softer than the face she'd been carrying awake. Still a child's face, still showing the architecture of all that trust and toughness she'd constructed to survive the last several days. But softer. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint, sweet chemical note of whatever Walcott had used on her sutures. Maddox stood in the doorway and looked at her. He was not a sentimental man. He had not been permitted to be sentimental at the age when sentiment calcifies into something load-bearing, and so he had grown the other thing instead. The practical kind of caring, the kind that expressed itself in action rather than feeling, in the doing rather than the naming of what the doing was for. He didn't examine what he felt looking at Wren Holloway asleep on an exam table. He just knew that whatever it was, it had the specific weight of things he would not negotiate. Walcott appeared beside him. You're moving her, he said. Not a question. Yes, I'm sorry. Don't be. Walcott leaned against the doorframe and looked at the girl with the same expression that competent doctors sometimes had, not detachment exactly, but the practiced distance of someone who let themselves care in a controlled and useful way. Where? Not sure yet. She needs the arm imaging in the next 24 hours. There's a diagnostic clinic in Ely that opens at 7. No affiliation with county, private practice, a woman named Torrance who owes me a question-free morning. He looked at Maddox. I can make a call. Do that. Maddox looked at him. Walcott. If anyone comes asking whether we were here, I'm a retired country doctor who gets confused about dates, Walcott said. I've been confused about dates for years. My memory's not what it was. Maddox nodded. Something in his chest, the specific tightness that had been there since the message about his brothers, eased by a fraction. He woke Wren gently, one hand on her shoulder, speaking her name before she was fully awake so that her body would have the word as an anchor before the consciousness arrived. She came up fast anyway, the sleep reflex of a child who had learned that sleep could end badly, and her good hand grabbed his wrist before her eyes were fully open. Hey, he said, same tone Silas used, low and even. It's Maddox. You're safe. We need to get moving. Her eyes focused. She looked around the room, clocking, processing, checking her own body the way people did when they weren't sure what they'd find. Then she looked at him. Did you find her? She asked. Not yet, he said. We know where she is. We're going to get her. He said it the way he'd said we're working on it, and I'm going to take you to a doctor. With the specific directness of a man who didn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but who also did not let uncertainty become a reason to say nothing. Wren looked at him for a moment. Then she sat up. They were on the road by 5 a.m., Silas with Wren, Maddox and Rhett flanking. The cold was different before dawn. Not the same clean cold of the deep night, but the gray, wet air cold that came with the hour before light, the hour that felt most like the world might not bother with morning. The road was empty. The stars had gone somewhere. Maddox rode with his headlight on and his mind running 2 parallel tracks. The tactical track, which was processing options and positions, and the geometry of where they were versus where Evelyn was versus where Decker might be moving. And the other track, the one underneath, which was running a different kind of inventory. 14 years. He'd known Decker Voss for 14 years. He'd trusted him with the club's books, the club's contacts, the club's internal deliberations about prospects and votes and debts of the kind clubs carry between members. He'd trusted him with the knowledge of his father's land, the way you mentioned things in Brotherhood, the way you said, "I've got 47 acres I don't know what to do with," over a beer, and thought nothing of it, because you were among your people. Among his people. The road unspooled ahead of him in the headlight, and he rode, and he let himself feel the specific quality of that betrayal for approximately 30 seconds, and then he put it somewhere else, because this was not the time. Boone had answered Silas's call. He'd said understood in the quiet, unfrightened way that Boone said most things, and he'd asked 2 targeted questions and then gone. Silas reported this at their first fuel stop with the assessment that the compound's security posture was being quietly adjusted and that Boone had not asked why Decker was being circumvented, which was either because he already knew something or because his trust in Silas's judgment was absolute. Either way, it was the right response. Ren ate a gas station granola bar and drank orange juice and sat on the concrete barrier outside the fuel station with her splinted arm in her lap and watched the horizon with the patient ferocity of someone who had decided to stay conscious and alert regardless of what her body wanted. Silas sat beside her. They didn't talk much. Silas wasn't a talker by default, and Ren had learned, somewhere in the process of crossing the desert alone, the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was held by someone present. She seemed to understand that Silas's silence was the second kind. Maddox stood away from the group and looked at the documents on his phone, the photographs he'd taken in the outbuilding, and went back through them more carefully now that he wasn't moving. What he found, going slowly, was a structure. Vale's operation had a structure with the kind of elegance that came from someone who had planned it over years and refined it. Meridian Asset Recovery as the visible face, a debt collection firm, legitimate in its paperwork, with county contacts in multiple Nevada jurisdictions. The county contacts, his assessors, clerks, one name that appeared to be a sheriff's deputy in Lincoln County, were the infrastructure that made the fraudulent debt instruments stick. You couldn't manufacture a credible debt without someone in county records to backdate the filing. You couldn't pressure someone off their property without someone in the county system to validate the claim. Decker had worked county government, briefly, before the club. Or so he'd said. Maddox looked at the signature again, at the dates on documents where it appeared. The earliest one was 9 years ago, 5 years before the acquisition list began, 4 years before Decker joined Black Horizon. He had not left county government to join the club. He had joined the club while still inside Vale's operation. The club was not his life after his government work. It was his cover during it. Maddox sat with this for a moment that felt longer than it was. He had given this man access to 23 people's lives. He put the phone away. They reached Eli at 6:45 in Walcott's contact, Dr. Torrance, 50, brisk, with the specifically incurious professionalism of someone who had decided long ago that context was not her department, had the imaging done by 7:30. The arm was confirmed as hairline, no surgical intervention needed. 4 weeks in a proper cast. She put the cast on with the efficiency of someone who had made thousands of them. Let Ren choose the color, blue, without hesitation, which for some reason compressed something in Maddox's chest. And they were back in the parking lot before 8. It was in the parking lot that Decker called. Maddox looked at the screen, considered, let it ring, let it go to voicemail. Looked at Rhett, who was watching him. "He knows we're awake," Rhett said. "Yes. If you don't answer, he knows we're avoiding him." "Also, yes." Maddox looked at the phone. The voicemail notification appeared. "Which means we're running out of time before he decides the approach has failed and tries something else." He played the voicemail on speaker quietly, turned away from where Silas and Ren were standing. Decker's voice was measured, casual. The voice of a man who had been maintaining a performance for a very long time and was very good at it. "Got some information on that number you sent. Can you call me back? Got some things you should know before you move." A pause. "Be careful out there, Prez." The last 2 words were what they always were. An affectionate rider on the end of a sentence, an acknowledgement of rank, the kind of thing you said to a man you respected, the kind of thing Decker had said to him for 14 years. Maddox deleted the voicemail. We're not calling back, he said. Then he'll move, Rhett said. If he's operational, he'll move. He'll assume you found something at the property. Then we need to move first. Maddox looked at the map on his phone. The distance between Ely and the coordinates he'd extrapolated from the documents. The most likely location for a holding facility that Meridian used for what the internal documents called asset compliance interviews. A storage facility registered to a shell company in a census-designated unincorporated area 20 miles south of Caliente. The documents hadn't named it explicitly, but the shell company appeared on 3 separate property transfer agreements as the receiving entity for assets stripped from families who'd been through Meridian's process. You stored what you took, and sometimes you stored people the same way. Evelyn Holloway was there. He had to believe that, or he had to believe something worse. He walked to Silas. We've got a location, he said. He showed him the map. Storage facility, registered to a shell company inside Vale's structure. It's the most likely place. Silas looked at it. Most likely. Yes. We going in the front? We're not going in at all without knowing what we're walking into. Maddox looked at Wren, who was watching them with the focused attention of a child who had learned that the conversations adults had near her were more important than the conversations they directed at her. Wren, the facility where they took your mama. Did your mama ever mention a place she went for meetings with the Meridian people? A building? An address? Wren thought about it. There was a place she had to go for papers, she said. Once. I stayed in the car. She said it smelled like metal and there were big doors. Big doors like a warehouse. Like a place where you keep trucks. Maddox looked at Silas. The location matched. They were 20 miles out and making time when the second call came. Not from Decker this time. Not from any number in his phone. A call from a number with the same exchange as the message about Evelyn, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was not what he expected. It was a woman. Controlled, exhausted, determined, all 3 at once in the compressed space of 3 words. He's on the way. Then, I'm Evelyn. The air rushed out of Maddox's lungs in one silent second. He said, Evelyn, are you? I have maybe a minute. Her voice was low, urgent, the voice of someone speaking into the small space between the moment someone was looking and the moment they came back. He's going to move me. Decker called. I heard them talking. They know you're coming. They're going to use me to... A sound in the background, a door, footsteps, and her voice dropped to almost nothing. Calvin has a partner you don't know about. Not Vale. Someone in your... The line went dead. Maddox held the phone against his ear in the silence that followed and rode through it, and the wind was cold and the road was straight and ahead of him. Somewhere a woman who had crossed the desert in a phone call was being moved to a place she didn't know about, and someone in his club, maybe Decker, maybe not only Decker, was the reason. She'd been about to say something else. 1 word, maybe 2. Someone in your brotherhood, club, life. His vision narrowed to the road and the distance ahead of it. He signaled Rhett, 2 taps on the tank, and the formation tightened, and they rode faster. And the Nevada morning opened around them in pale gold and cold blue. And somewhere behind them in the Peosha direction, a pair of headlights appeared that had not been there 20 seconds before and matched their speed without closing and without falling back. They were not alone on this road. They had not been alone since Peosha. And Maddox Creed, who had spent 23 years building a brotherhood to stand between the vulnerable and the world's cruelty, now rode toward a concrete building where a woman waited on a concrete floor, with the knowledge that the brotherhood itself had been the door through which everything terrible had entered. The headlights behind him held their distance. Patient, like they were waiting for the exact right moment, like they had always known exactly how this road ended. Maddox did not look back at the headlights. Looking back was information he already had. He knew the distance, 200 yards, consistent. And he knew the intent, which was not to close but to track, to maintain awareness of his position while something else moved into place ahead of him. That was how you ran a pincer on a road with no exits. You put a slow tail behind, and you put a fast block in front, and you waited for the geometry to resolve itself. He keyed his comm, the earpiece they'd been running silent since Pioche. Rhett. I see them. Rhett's voice in his ear was the same as it always was, flat, present, entirely without the kind of fear that came from not knowing what you were doing. Single vehicle, running standard tailing distance. They're not trying to be invisible. They want us to know. Yes. Which meant the pressure was intentional, which meant someone wanted them thinking about what was behind them rather than what was in front. Silas, Maddox said. Copy. Silas had Wren on his bike. His voice was tight in a way Maddox had learned to read as controlled urgency. The medics register when the situation required action faster than comfort. Next intersection, you take the 9 o'clock road. Don't stop, don't look back, ride to the coordinates I'm sending now. His thumb moved across the phone screen. Check. An address 40 miles north, a Black Horizon Associates property. A man named Garrett, whose sole relevant quality at this moment was that Decker had never been to his land and wouldn't know his name. You stay there with her. You keep your comm open. And if you don't, I'll call. Maddox. I'll call, Silas. His voice left no room. Take her. The intersection came up fast. A crossroads with no signage, just two strips of cracked asphalt meeting in the high desert. The kind of junction that appeared on satellite maps but not in anyone's mental geography. Silas peeled left without decelerating, the sound of his engine opening up briefly as he accelerated away, and then the sound diminished and was gone, and there were two of them. The headlights behind them did not follow Silas. They stayed on Maddox. They don't care about her, Rhett said. No. Maddox had already understood this. Wren was never the prize. She was the mechanism. The device that had placed him exactly where Vale needed him to be, moving toward a facility where Evelyn Holloway was being held, on a road where he could be managed, with a leadership question inside his own club that made him isolated and untrustworthy to his own people. Elegant work. Patient work. The work of someone who understood that the most effective trap was one the target walked into, believing it was a rescue. We're still going in, Rhett said. Not a question. Yes. Two of us. Yes. A pause that lasted 3 seconds, which from Rhett was a significant duration. Okay, he said. They came off the highway onto the access road that Maddox had identified from the documents. An unmarked turnoff behind a rusted cattle gate that had been left open, which was either negligence or invitation, and the distinction didn't change the direction. The storage facility was visible from half a mile, a low concrete structure, industrial, the kind built in the 1980s for agricultural equipment and repurposed slowly by whoever needed anonymous square footage in a place where no one was driving past. 2 large roll doors on the front face, 1 standard entry door, a single exterior light mounted above the entry that threw a yellow cone into the surrounding dark. Maddox cut his engine at 300 yards and coasted. Rhett followed. The silence that replaced the engine noise was the particular silence of a place far from anything, total, physical, the kind you could feel in your sinuses. He walked the bike behind a concrete drainage berm and laid it on its side quietly, the practiced movement of a man who had needed to not be found on enough occasions to have developed the muscle memory. Rhett did the same. The headlights from the road had stopped at the turnoff, not following onto the access road, staying at the gate, watching. Someone inside the building, Rhett said, barely above a breath. He had gone to a crouch at the end of the berm and was looking at the facility with a stillness that belonged to an earlier version of himself, the version that had spent years in terrain exactly like this, reading structures, reading ground, reading the geometry of where people would be and where they wouldn't. Entry doors been used recently. The dirt's disturbed. 2 sets of prints, maybe 3. Could be more inside. Calvin's people. At least, could be Vale's security if they moved her in anticipation. Evelyn had said he's going to move me. Past tense progressive. Happening now or about to. Which meant the window was not wide. Cover approach, Maddox said. Rhett moved without another word, going wide to the right in a low profile, using the dark outside the exterior light's cone. He moved like water moving, like the ground absorbed him. Maddox watched him go and then looked at the entry door and thought about what was on the other side of it. He reached under his cut and made sure of what was there. What was there was what it always was, and he was not going to detail it further to himself. He was not going to narrate what he was about to do because narrating it made it something it didn't need to be. It was simple. There was a woman on a concrete floor who had managed to get one phone call out at enormous personal risk, and between her and the outside world was a door and whatever was behind it. He walked toward the door, not running, walking, because running made noise and burned reserves he might need in the next 5 minutes, and because a man walking toward a door in the dark looked like a man who belonged there if you caught him in your peripheral vision, and because the headlights at the gate were still watching and he was not going to show them a sprint. His boots on the hard dirt were quiet. His breathing was controlled. His heart was doing the thing it did in these moments, not racing exactly, but amplifying, each beat slightly more present than the last. The body's way of telling you that the things it had been built for were now operational. He reached the door. Metal, industrial, a thumb latch handle. He put his hand on it. From inside, voices, low, male, more than one. The acoustics of concrete making them flat and directionless. He pressed his ear against the door's cold metal surface and listened for 4 seconds. Said, "Move her before 7. It's past 7. Calvin hasn't called back. I don't care about Calvin. I care about the timeline." "Then you call Vale and tell him we're moving a woman who can barely—" "I don't call Vale directly. Neither do you. We wait for Calvin." A pause. The sound of something metallic, a chair leg, a door handle, indeterminate. "Creed's on the road. Watcher confirmed. He's here." Maddox registered this without reaction. They knew he was outside, which meant the approach had been seen, or the watcher at the gate had communicated ahead, or both. He stepped back from the door. Rhett appeared at his left elbow from nowhere, which was one of the things about Rhett that you never fully adjusted to. "2 vehicles around the east side," Rhett said, his mouth close to Maddox's ear. 3 men outside that I can see. More inside based on what I heard through the side wall. Roll doors are locked from inside." He paused. "There's a second entrance. West face. Service door. Padlocked from outside." "Padlocked from outside means no one's in that corner." "Yes." "That's where she is." "Probably." From inside the building, the voices had gone quiet, which was different from before and worse because quiet meant they'd shifted to a different mode. The talking mode had ended. Something else had begun. "Rhett." Maddox kept his voice almost nothing. "East side men. Can you manage them without the inside group hearing?" A pause. 2 of 3. The third is too close to the roll door. I need 60 seconds from the moment I breached the service door." Rhett looked at him. The exterior light was far enough away that his face was mostly shadow, but the part that wasn't shadow had the expression of a man who was doing math that he didn't entirely like the answer to. 60 seconds is tight. "I know." "If there are more than 3 inside, Mum." "I know, Rhett." A moment. 60 seconds, Rhett said. "Starting when I move." He was gone again. Maddox went west. The service door was around the corner of the building, away from the exterior light, in a darkness that was nearly complete. He found it by feel and by the sound of the padlock against the door when the night wind moved. A small, dull knock of metal that told him exactly where to put his hands. The padlock was a standard commercial model, the kind that was adequate against casual entry and meaningless against the bolt cutters attached to Rhett's bike kit. But Rhett was not here. Maddox was here. What he had was time and the understanding that padlocked from outside meant the mechanism was exposed. He worked it. 40 seconds. His hands were steady because he made them steady, and the cold metal of the padlock was sharp against his fingers, and he thought about nothing except the mechanism. It came open. He pushed the door inward, slowly, controlling the creak that wanted to happen with equal and opposite pressure, the way you moved a door that didn't want to be quiet, and slipped inside. The interior was larger than the exterior had suggested. Concrete floor, bare concrete walls, the smell of oil and rust, and underneath that something human. Sweat, fear, the particular staleness of air that had been breathed too many times in a closed space. Strip lighting overhead, industrial, throwing everything in the flat visibility of a place designed for function. At the far end, the roll doors. In the middle, 2 men. both turning toward the direction of the entry door, their backs partially to him, responding to some sound or instinct from the front of the building. And in the near corner, on the floor, against the wall he'd identified from outside, Evelyn Holloway. She saw him before either of the two men did. Her eyes came up from the floor, dark eyes, her daughter's eyes, carrying the same quality of exhausted assessment that Wren had carried in the desert but deeper, aged by days of this. And something in her face shifted. Not relief. Recognition. The dangerous kind of hope that survivors allowed themselves only when they were certain they weren't misreading the situation. He put one finger to his lips. She held still. Good. She understood. The closer of the two men turned. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not something Maddox narrated to himself. It was physical information, processed and responded to in the operational present tense, and it was sufficient. The first man was closer and slower, and the concrete floor meant Maddox's boots had 2 steps of full noise before he reached him, and 2 steps was enough warning for the man to start turning and not enough to finish it. The second man was farther and faster and had the additional half-second of seeing what happened to the first man before he needed to make his own decisions, and his decision was not the one Maddox would have made in his position. He went for his radio instead of for distance. Maddox reached him before the call connected. The radio hit the concrete floor. The sound it made was larger than Maddox wanted in the closed space. He heard it bounce and stop and stood in the ringing silence that followed, breathing through his nose, checking himself for damage, a cut across his left forearm from the first man's initial reaction, not deep, bleeding in the committed way of forearm cuts. And he was going to be aware of it, but not changed by it, and looked at Evelyn. He crossed to her in 4 steps. Her wrists were zip-tied together in front of her, which was both a restraint and an oversight. He pulled the blade from his boot. She held her wrists steady with the specific stillness of someone who trusted the person with the knife, and the tie came free. She grabbed his wrist. Her hands were cold, and her grip was stronger than he expected from 3 days on a concrete floor. "There's a third one," she said. "He went outside 10 minutes ago. My man is handling the outside." "Your man." She processed this while getting her feet under her, slowly, her legs having been in one position too long, the pins and needles of returning circulation visible in the way she moved. "How many of you?" "2." Something moved through her expression. She looked at him, really looked, the full inventory of a woman who had learned over the last 3 days to read men very quickly for what they were and were not. Whatever she found, she accepted. "Okay," she said. From outside, a sound. Engines. Not motorcycles. Vehicles. More than one, from the direction of the road. Maddox went to the service door and looked through the gap. Headlights, 3 sets, moving up the access road at speed. Not the waiting vehicle from the gate. New vehicles, arriving with the urgency of people who had been called in, who had received information that required a faster response than patience. Calvin had called back. His comm crackled. Rhett's voice. 3 incoming vehicles, multiple occupants. East side is clear, but I'm counting 6 or 7 total incoming. A pause, just a breath. "Maddox, that's a hard number for 2. "I know." "Options." Maddox looked at Evelyn. He looked at the 2 inert men on the concrete floor. He looked at the service door and the darkness beyond it, and the growing light of 3 approaching sets of headlights. Then his phone buzzed. A call. Not Decker, not an unknown number, a number he knew but hadn't expected, hadn't dared to expect, because hoping for it would have made the not having it too heavy. "Boone." He answered it. "Tell me something good," he said. Boone's voice was the voice of a man who had been awake and moving for hours, and who was calm in the way that men were calm when the decision had already been made, and now it was just the execution. 11 bikes, 20 minutes behind you. Decker's in lockdown at the compound. He tried to leave. He's not leaving. Everybody else is on the road. A pause. "You hold for 20 minutes, Prez." 20 minutes. 3 vehicles rolling up an access road, 6 or 7 men, 2 bikers and a woman who could barely stand on one side of a concrete wall. Maddox looked at Evelyn, and she looked back at him. And her eyes said the thing that eyes said when they were done asking whether the situation was survivable and were simply asking whether the person in front of them was going to hold. He said, into the phone, "Copy that." and ended the call. He looked at Evelyn. "Can you run?" he said. She tested her legs, flexed her feet. The wince was controlled. "Tell me where." "There's a drainage berm 300 yards north, low profile concrete. You get there and you stay flat." "And you?" "I'm going to make sure they know where I am." He looked at her steadily. "That's the job right now. Make myself visible and make them slow. 20 minutes. Evelyn looked at him, at the cut on his arm, at the calm in his face that she was old enough and experienced enough to understand was not the absence of fear, but what you built on top of it. "Ren," she said. His name wasn't what she said, but what she meant was, she's safe. She's whole. She's waiting for you. He said it without decoration, the plain factual promise of a man who kept his accounting clean. Blue cast on her arm, her choice. Something in Evelyn's face broke and remade itself in the span of a single second. She didn't cry. She made the face that was on the other side of crying. The face of someone who had been holding the possibility of the worst thing at bay by pure will and had just been told they didn't have to hold it anymore, and whose whole body was reconfiguring around that information. She said, "Okay?" Just that. "Go," he said. She went. Out the service door into the dark, moving faster than her 3 days on the floor should have allowed, because the human body under the right conditions found reserves that the resting self didn't know it had. Maddox watched her clear the corner of the building. Then he walked to the roll doors, and he pulled the release, and the nearest one began its loud, grinding, mechanical ascent into the night. The sound filling the dark, filling the distance, announcing him to every set of headlights on the access road. 3 vehicles stopped. He stood in the open roll door with the interior light behind him, and the night in front of him, and the cold air moving against his face. And he looked at the stopped vehicles and waited. A door opened. A man he hadn't seen before stepped out. Not Calvin's build, not Calvin's posture. Broader, more deliberate. The posture of someone who was accustomed to being the largest force in any given room. A man in his late 40s, dressed in the civilian uniform of money that was trying not to look like money. Dark clothes, no logos, the kind of watch that cost more than the vehicles on either side of him. The man looked at Maddox across the 40 yards between them. Maddox looked back. "Mr. Creed," the man said. His voice carried across the desert air with the ease of someone who had spent decades making rooms quiet by speaking. "I've been wanting to have a conversation." Gideon Vale. He was here himself. Not on a phone, not through a proxy. Here. Standing in the dirt of an unnamed access road in the middle of Nevada at 7 in the morning with 3 vehicles and 6 men behind him, looking at Maddox Creed with the specific expression of a man who believed that his presence alone was sufficient pressure to close a negotiation. "You drove a long way," Maddox said. "Some conversations require proximity." Vale took 1 step forward. Not aggressive, deliberate. The step of a man controlling the pace of things. "You found some of my documents. That's inconvenient, but it's manageable if we're adults about it." "Where's Calvin?" Maddox said. A slight shift in Vale's expression, something under the composed surface. Calvin is no longer the relevant question, which meant Calvin was the answer to a different question, the question of what happened to the boots-on-ground man when he became a liability. "You built something," Maddox said. He needed time. He kept Vale talking, and he kept his voice even, and he did not look at his watch. 5 years, property across 3 counties. You needed someone inside the communities, someone trusted, someone with access to the MC network, because the MC network knows every rural property owner in a 3-state area. You needed Decker. Vale looked at him, not confirming, not denying, listening. "What did you offer him?" Maddox said. "The same thing I offer everyone," Vale said. "A solution to a problem." Decker had debts of his own, the kind of debts that don't come from banks. He paused. "People make arrangements, Mr. Creed. It's not personal." Maddox felt something move through him. A slow, cold thing, moving from his chest outward, through his arms and his hands. not rage. The precursor to rage held very still. "You used my club," he said. "Your club provided information," Vale said. "The use was mine." Behind Vale, the 6 men had spread slightly. Not dramatically, not in the choreographed way of people performing threat, but in the organic way of people positioning. Maddox tracked it without looking directly at it, using the peripheral reading he'd developed over 20 years of situations where the edge of his vision was more important than the center. He needed 12 more minutes. "You're on my property list," Vale said. "That doesn't have to be a problem. The water rights under your father's land, frankly, you didn't know you had them. You've never used them. What I'm offering—" "I know what you're offering," Maddox said. "Then you know it's the intelligent—" "I know what you're offering," Maddox said again, quieter. "I've watched you offer it to 30 families whose names are in your files. I know what happens to the ones who take it and the ones who don't." His eyes moved to Vale's face and stayed there. "You don't have leverage anymore. Evelyn Holloway is out of that building. Her testimony, your documents, and the specific attention of people I've already contacted are outside your ability to manage." He kept his voice level, flat, the voice of a man stating facts rather than making threats, because facts required no performance. "The intelligent move is yours to make." Vale was quiet for a moment. The composed surface was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The first suggestion of a man recalculating, reassessing the geometry of a situation he had believed was controlled. One of his men had moved to within 15 yards of the roll door. Maddox did not look at him. "You came here alone," Vale said. 2 men on motorcycles. From the road, from the highway junction, from the direction of Pioche and Eli, and everywhere north, the sound arrived before the light did. Not 1 engine, not 3. 11. The sound of 11 Harley-Davidson motorcycles running hard on an open highway was not a subtle sound. It was not a sound that allowed for reinterpretation. It was a low building wall of controlled thunder that crossed the desert air like something geological. Like the sound was part of the landscape, had always been part of it, was simply being reminded of its own presence. Gideon Vale turned toward the road. The headlights came over the rise and down the access road in a column, single file, the formation precise. The spacing of men who rode together often enough that the road between them had become a conversation. Maddox watched Vale's face, watched the moment the calculation changed. The first bike reached the facility's outer perimeter and stopped, and the ones behind it stopped in sequence, and the engines cut one by one until the last one cut, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Maddox had heard all night. 11 men on 11 bikes, cuts bright in the headlights, Black Horizon MC in gold thread, worn down to history. Boone was on the lead bike. He did not get off. He sat with his hands on his bars and looked at Gideon Vale and his men with the patient, absolute stillness of a man who had nowhere else to be. Vale looked at the 11 men. He looked at Maddox. He looked at the 6 men around him who had gone very still in the way people went still when the math had changed completely, and they were each doing their own version of it. The cut on Maddox's forearm was still bleeding, slow and committed, and he could feel the warmth of it against the cold of the morning air, and his legs were tired and his eyes were tired, and somewhere in the middle distance Evelyn Holloway was behind a drainage berm waiting, and 40 miles north Wren was waiting with a blue cast on her arm, and the Nevada morning was going gold at the edges of the horizon. Vale looked at him. "This isn't over," he said. Maddox looked back. "It is," he said. "You just don't know it yet." And he pulled out his phone and he dialed the number that Silas had found 2 nights ago on a business card in the documents. A federal contact, the kind of number you used when the evidence you had was more than local law enforcement was equipped to process, and less than you wanted to sit on for 1 more second. It rang once. Someone answered. And Gideon Vale, standing in the Nevada dirt with 11 bikers behind the man he'd spent 5 years trying to dismantle, heard Maddox Creed begin to speak in the level, unhurried voice of a man who had everything he needed and nothing left to protect except the truth. The morning light came fully up, and the desert held its breath. The federal contact's name was Huang, and she arrived 4 hours later in a black SUV with 2 colleagues and the specific controlled energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of call and had a prepared response ready to deploy. She was not what Vale had expected. Maddox could see that in the way Vale watched her cross the dirt toward him. The slight recalibration, the reassessment, the composed surface doing extra work. He had expected local. He had expected something manageable. What he got was a woman who had been building a file on Meridian asset recovery for 11 months and needed one thing she hadn't been able to get from inside a Las Vegas office: a witness with documents, a victim with testimony, and a physical location where the operation had been actively conducted. Maddox gave her all three before 8 a.m. Evelyn came out from behind the drainage berm when Silas brought a vehicle up the access road. Not a bike, a truck borrowed from Garrett's property, driven by one of the club brothers who had the practical sense to understand that a woman who'd been on a concrete floor for 3 days needed 4 walls around her before she needed anything else. She walked toward the truck with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had decided that her legs were going to work regardless of what they thought about it. And when Silas opened the door and she saw the back seat and the blanket laid across it, she stopped for one moment and put her hand against the door frame and just breathed. "Your daughter is 40 miles north," Silas said. He kept his voice even. He knew how to give information to people in shock, plainly, without embellishment, without the emotional freight that made it harder to process. "She's safe. She has a blue cast. She picked the color herself." Evelyn made a sound that was almost nothing. She nodded once and got in the truck, and Silas closed the door. Maddox watched this from 20 yards away. He was standing with Huang, who was taking his account with the efficient shorthand of someone who had learned to extract maximum information from minimum time. He talked and watched Evelyn in the truck and answered Huang's questions, and somewhere in the background he was aware of Gideon Vale being placed in the back of a different vehicle, and of Vale's 6 men being processed by Huang's colleagues, and of Boone standing at the edge of the activity with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had ridden through the night for this moment and found it sufficient. Vale said nothing as they put him in the vehicle. He looked at Maddox once, across the distance, with the expression of a man who was already inside the next calculation, already deciding which parts of his structure he could sacrifice to protect the parts that remained, already building the argument that would make what he'd done into something a certain kind of lawyer could work with. The expression of a man who had never fully believed in consequences, because consequences had always been for other people. Maddox looked back at him without expression, without satisfaction, without the particular heat that Vale probably expected from a man whose brotherhood had been used and whose property had been targeted. There was nothing available in that direction that was worth the energy of having it. He turned back to Huang. He talked for 40 minutes. She asked precise questions, and he gave precise answers, and the documents on his phone were transferred to her device with the reliability of evidence that had been properly handled, and when it was done, she looked at him with the specific assessment of a federal investigator who had arrived expecting a complicated asset and found a straightforward witness. "The club member," she said. "Voss. He'll be at the compound when you want him," Maddox said. "He's not going anywhere." "And the county contacts named in the documents." "Whoever Boone's been in contact with on that end since last night," Maddox said, and looked at Boone, who came over and gave Huang 3 names, a county, and the specific document references with the methodical completeness of a man who had spent the pre-dawn hours being useful from a distance. Huang looked at Boone, then back at Maddox. "You had all of this assembled before you called me." "I called you when I had Evelyn Holloway safe," Maddox said. "Not before." She held his gaze for a moment. Whatever she thought about that priority, she kept behind her professional face. "We'll need formal statements, both of you and Ms. Holloway, when she's medically cleared." "You know where to find us," Maddox said. The SUVs left. The access road settled into quiet. The morning had fully arrived now, pale gold and cold, the Nevada sky scrubbed clean by the overnight wind, the kind of morning that looked like it was apologizing for the night before. Maddox stood in the dirt and looked at the concrete building and felt the cut on his forearm pulsing with the steady, honest communication of an injury that had been patient, while other things took priority and was now requesting acknowledgement. He pressed his hand over it, The bleeding had slowed to something manageable. Silas appeared beside him as he had appeared beside him for years, with the precise timing of a man who always knew when he was needed without being asked. He had a field dressing in his hand. "Sit down," Silas said. "I'm standing." "Then stand still." He unwrapped the dressing. "It's not deep, but it needs closing." He worked without ceremony, cleaning and closing the cut with the competence of a man who had been doing this since before he was old enough to understand the full weight of it. His hands were steady, both of them, the left as steady as the right, which happened sometimes when he was in the work, when the work gave his body permission to stop shaking. Maddox noticed this and said nothing about it. "Decker," Silas said while he worked. "Boone has him." "What happens?" Maddox looked at the sky. "That's a club matter," he said. "We vote. And your vote." A pause. "He answers to Huang, fully. He cooperates and he gives them everything that reduces the exposure to the families Vale took from." He felt Silas's hand still briefly on his arm, then resume. "After that, he's out. Not violence, not revenge. Out. His cut, his name, his place. Out. That's more than some would give him." "It's less than he deserves and more than I want to," Maddox said. "But I've spent 23 years building something that doesn't run on what I want." Silas tied off the dressing. He stepped back and looked at Maddox with the expression he had when he'd decided something. The expression of finality, of a thing settled in the interior where the real decisions lived. "When this is done," he said, "when the statements are made and Decker's handled and the property stuff is sorted, I want to talk about the land." Maddox looked at him. "What about it?" "The 47 acres, what you're going to do with it." Silas looked at the horizon. "I've been thinking about it since you told me it was on the list, about what it means that it was on the list, that it was worth something to someone with Vale's resources." He paused. "Water rights, aquifer access, that's not nothing." "No. There are uses for that kind of land that don't involve selling it to someone like Vale." Maddox watched the side of his face. "What kind of uses?" "The kind we decide together," Silas said. "All of us." It was the most Silas had ever said about the future in a single breath, and Maddox understood the weight of it, understood that it was not a suggestion about land. It was a suggestion about what came after, about whether the thing they'd built was still worth building in the shape it had been in, or whether it needed to find a new shape. He didn't answer. But he didn't look away either, and between them that was the same thing as answering. They drove north, the club rode in two groups. The 11 who'd come in the night, and the 3 who'd started this, no longer distinguishable in the formation, merged back into the body of the thing. Maddox rode in the middle of it, and felt the sound of it around him. The combined engine note of 11 bikes running together, each slightly different, each voice in the chord distinct if you knew what to listen for. And for the first time since the message about his brothers, he felt the tightness in his chest released by something measurable. Not fully, not clean. The Decker-shaped hole in the Brotherhood was going to be there for a long time, and the shape it left was the particular shape of a trust that had been load-bearing and turned out to be hollow. That kind of structural damage didn't heal the way physical damage did. It left the place you'd trusted as a foundation forever slightly suspect, requiring the kind of conscious maintenance that trust never required before. But the road was there, the engines were there, and somewhere 40 miles ahead, Wren Holloway was waiting with a blue cast and her mother coming. He rode. Garrett's property was a modest place, a working ranch, functional rather than beautiful, with a long gravel drive and a main house that looked like it had been added to over decades by people who needed more room rather than more aesthetics. The bikes rolled in slowly, the engines dropping to idle and then cutting one by one, and the silence after 11 engines stopped had a quality that silence after single engines didn't. Fuller, more earned, the silence of something large coming to rest. Wren was on the porch. She had heard them coming from a long way off because the sound of 11 Harleys on an open approach was not something you needed good hearing to detect, and she was standing at the porch railing with her blue cast against the railing's edge and her eyes moving across the formation with the systematic focus of a child looking for one specific face. She found Maddox's. He was off the bike before it was fully still, which was not something he did, which was not something his body had done in a long time without a tactical reason. And he walked toward the porch, and she walked down the steps, and they met in the gravel drive, and she didn't run at him because she was 7 years old, and she had been very tough for a very long time. And she wasn't going to stop being tough now, and he didn't crouch down to her level because she had never needed that from him. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. "Is she okay?" Ren asked. "She's on her way," he said. 20 minutes behind us." Ren nodded. She pressed her lips together in the way she had, the way she controlled what her face wanted to do with information that was too big for it. "Your arm hurt?" he asked. "Some?" She looked at the blue cast. "Silas said I could get signatures on it." "Yeah?" "He said you'd probably sign it even though you have bad handwriting." Maddox looked at the cast, at the child in front of him who had walked barefoot across the Nevada desert with a cracked bone and dried blood in her hair to find someone, anyone, standing between her mother and the dark. "I have fine handwriting," he said. Something broke through the controlled face then. Not tears, just the smallest crack in the 7-year-old architecture of toughness. A flash of something that looked like relief but wasn't quite relief yet. Was the thing just before relief. The moment when you first let yourself believe the bad thing was actually over. She looked past him at the 11 men standing with their bikes in the gravel, at the cuts, at the Black Horizon MC in worn gold thread. "All of them came," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because of me." Maddox looked at her steadily. "Because of who you are," he said, "and because of what we are." He paused. "That's how it works." She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Then she nodded once, as if filing it. The truck came up the drive 18 minutes later. Maddox had positioned himself near the barn when it came, not on the porch, not in the center of the drive, but to the side, giving the space to what needed to happen in it. He watched Silas open the truck door and Evelyn step out, moving stiffly, but moving, her eyes going immediately to the porch where Ren was standing. Ren went down the steps, not running. Walking, and then something between walking and running that had no name. The specific gait of a child whose body was doing what it needed to do before her brain caught up with it. And Evelyn came forward across the gravel and dropped to her knees before Ren reached her, and they closed the distance together. The sound Evelyn made was private. Maddox looked away. So did every man in the drive, looking at various points in the middle distance, at the sky, at their boots, at the horses visible in the far field. Men who had come through the night for this moment, and who understood, in the way that men like them understood things, that the moment didn't belong to them. Rhett had moved to stand beside Maddox. He looked at the fence line and the field. "Good horses," he said. "Yeah," Maddox said. They stood there for a while. Garrett's wife made coffee, an enormous quantity of it, and set it out in the main house kitchen with bread and whatever else she could put together on short notice for 14 people who had been awake since the previous afternoon. The club filled the kitchen and the front room and the porch, eating and drinking with the particular quiet energy of men who had done a hard thing and were now doing the necessary work of returning to ordinary life. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with Ren beside her, Ren's good hand in both of Evelyn's, the blue cast resting on the table's surface. She drank her coffee slowly and looked at the room around her with the adjusted eyes of someone seeing ordinary things as extraordinary because they hadn't been guaranteed. Maddox sat across from her. He had coffee he hadn't drunk yet. The cut on his arm was dressed and the dressing was beginning to show through. Silas would change it later. "The property," Maddox said. Evelyn looked at him. "What about it?" "Huang's team will move on the fraudulent debt instruments, all of them, across all the properties in the acquisition list, yours included. The claim meridian filed against your land is manufactured. There'll be documentation of that now, enough to vacate it." He paused. "That takes time. It's not this week, but it happens." Evelyn absorbed this. "And the water rights?" "Yours, clear." He held her gaze. "Nobody's taking your land, Ms. Holloway." She looked down at her coffee. Her thumb moved across Wren's knuckles in a small, automatic gesture. The same gesture she'd probably been making since Wren was a baby, the unconscious language of a parent reassuring themselves that the child was present and whole. "I had a number I was calling," she said, "before trying to get help. A county legal aid office. They kept telling me the debt was valid, that the paperwork checked out." She paused. "I didn't know where else to go." "The county contacts were Vales," Maddox said. "The assessors, the clerk. They were inside the system. Anyone you went to locally would have been talking to the same machine. So there was no way." "There was no local way," he said. "That was the design." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at him with the direct look she had. The same look as Wren's, the genetic bedrock of it. "Why did you get involved?" she said. "When she came to you? You didn't know her. You didn't know me. You had no reason to eat." "She asked," he said. Evelyn looked at him. "She came out of the desert, and she asked," he said. "That's the whole of it." He picked up his coffee. "Men like us spend a lot of years looking like the threat. People walk to the other side of the street. They don't ask us for anything. When someone asks..." He stopped, looked at the coffee. "We don't forget it." Wren had been listening. She looked at Maddox with the expression she had when she was cataloging something, when she was deciding where to file a piece of information in the taxonomy of the world she was building. Then she looked at her blue cast. "You still have to sign it," she said. Boone found a marker from somewhere. Boone always found what was needed from somewhere, which was why he was the sergeant-at-arms. And Maddox took it and signed the cast in letters that were, in fact, perfectly legible. And Wren examined his signature and apparently found it acceptable. Every man in the room signed it after that. 14 signatures on a blue cast on a 7-year-old's arm in a ranch house kitchen in the Nevada desert on a morning that had come after a night that had cost what it cost. Wren held her arm up and looked at the signatures, and then held it against her chest. 3 weeks later, Gideon Vale was in federal custody. Meridian Asset Recovery had its Nevada operating license suspended pending investigation. The county assessor in Lincoln County had been placed on administrative leave. 2 other county employees named in the documents had retained lawyers. Decker Voss cooperated fully. Huang had come to the compound with 2 federal colleagues and spent 4 hours with him, and left with a thumb drive and a recorded statement that Maddox's lawyer told him was comprehensive enough to constitute significant cooperation. Decker had looked at Maddox once, across the compound's main room, while Huang's people were packing. The look had in it something that wasn't quite remorse and wasn't quite explanation. The look of a man who knew he had done what he had done and was no longer in a position to make it mean anything different than what it meant. Maddox had held the look for 3 seconds and then looked away, because there was nothing available in that direction either, and there never would be. The vote had been unanimous. Decker Voss was removed from Black Horizon MC. His cut stayed at the compound. He left with his bike and his clothes and the specific weight of having been trusted and choosing otherwise, which was a weight that didn't diminish with distance. Maddox had not watched him go. He'd been in the back office looking at the photographs on the wall. The Laughlin run photo, the group shot, 10 men in a Nevada morning. He'd taken it down and put it in a drawer. Not destroyed, just filed. The land came back to him formally 6 weeks after that. A county filing, a correction of record, a document with more stamps on it than seemed strictly necessary, but documents with many stamps were how the government apologized. The 47 acres of high desert north of Caliente, with water rights attached, now clearly under the name Maddox Creed. No encumbrances, no fraudulent debt instruments, no Meridian claims. He drove out to it one evening in late October, parked his bike at the fence line and walked in a ways on foot. The land was flat and rough, and the vegetation was the specific vocabulary of high desert: scrub, juniper, the occasional Joshua that had been there longer than anyone could verify. The light at that hour was the autumn light, the gold that had something going out in it, something getting ready for the long dark. He stood in the middle of his father's land and looked at the sky. He didn't think about his father much. The man had been gone for 30 years, and the thinking about him was mostly done. Had been done in the years right after, in the years when he'd needed a father and had had only the absence of one, and in the years later when he'd built things that were, in some sense, the things he'd built in the father's absence. The club, the brotherhood, the understanding that family was not biological destiny, but deliberate construction, and that the construction required maintenance and could fail and needed to be rebuilt when it did. He thought about Wren. She and Evelyn were back on the property southeast of Caliente. The house had been cleaned out, evidence collected, what needed to go had gone, and then cleaned by 4 club brothers who had shown up on a Saturday morning with mops and intentions, and had worked until the house smelled like coffee and pine cleaner instead of fear. The water cistern at the east end had been checked and repaired by Rhett, who had a competence with mechanical systems that extended to water infrastructure and who had done the work without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. Evelyn had told Maddox this. She had called him the week they moved back in, and she had said the things she'd been building towards saying for several weeks. The account of what the last several months had been like, what it had meant to have the thing that was supposed to help you fail so completely that a child's last resort was to walk into the desert alone and find strangers. She said it plainly, without the shape of an accusation and without the shape of gratitude either, just the shape of the truth, which was the hardest shape. He had listened. He had said, "You did right by her. Every decision you made to protect her. That's the whole record." A silence on the line. Then, "She talks about you, all 3 of you." "What does she say?" "She says you're dangerous, but you made her feel safe." A pause. "She said it exactly like that. I asked her where she'd heard that phrase. She said she made it up." Maddox had stood with that for a moment. Then he'd said he was glad she was home. There was one more thing. On a Sunday in November, Wren and Evelyn came to the compound. Not for any occasion, Wren had asked to see where the bikers lived, with the specific logistical curiosity of a child who wanted to understand the full geography of a thing she'd incorporated into her map of the world. And Evelyn had brought her because the answer to a child asking to see where the people who saved her life lived was not no. The compound was the compound, a converted industrial property, functional and unbeautiful, with a main building and a workshop and a yard where bikes were kept and worked on, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee and the faint ghost of every meal ever made in it. It was not impressive. It was not meant to be impressive. It was meant to be the kind of place where men who needed to belong to something could come and be that thing. Wren walked through it with her blue cast. The cast had been replaced with a new one, still blue, her choice again. And she asked questions that Maddox answered and that Silas answered and that Rhett did not answer because Rhett was not a question-answering type, but who showed her the workbench and let her watch him adjust the carburetor on a bike that wasn't running right, which was its own kind of answer. She stood in the workshop for a long time watching Rhett work. Then she went to the main building and asked Silas for paper and a pencil. Silas found paper and a pencil from the same inexhaustible supply that Boone found markers from, the compound's talent for producing necessary things. She drew for 20 minutes. Maddox made coffee, and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, and they talked in the way that people talked when they had been through something large together, and the largeness of it was still sorting itself into language, slowly, with room for silence, without the pressure to make it into a narrative before it was ready. When Wren was done, she came to Maddox with the drawing. 4 figures, rendered in the direct, honest style of a child who had not yet learned to doubt her own visual vocabulary. 3 large figures in what were clearly leather jackets, 1 small figure beside them. Above them, a sky full of circles that were stars. Below them, a line that was a road. The figures were not doing anything dramatic, they were just standing. At the bottom, in capital letters, careful and legible, the people who kept walking. Maddox looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Wren, who was watching him with the expression she had when she was trying to decide whether something was good or not good, whether the thing she'd done had landed the way she'd intended it to. "Can I keep this?" he asked. She nodded, serious. He walked into the workshop, and he found a finishing nail in the drawer above the workbench, and he hammered it into the wall above his tools, above the old motorcycle parts, above the accumulated evidence of years of work on machines that needed someone to take care of them, and he hung the drawing on the nail. It was small on the big concrete wall. The figures were unsteady, and the stars were approximate, and the letters at the bottom were slightly uneven. He stood back and looked at it. Rhett came to stand beside him, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He looked at the drawing, said nothing. Silas leaned in the doorway and looked at it. Said nothing. Behind them, from the kitchen, the sound of Evelyn and Boone's wife talking. The real conversation. The building of something conversation that happened between people deciding whether the world they'd nearly lost was worth rebuilding and deciding yes. And under that, Wren's feet on the concrete floor, moving between rooms, learning the geography of a place that was not her place, but that had a door she could use. The Nevada afternoon light came in through the workshop's high windows and lay across the concrete floor in long rectangles, and the engines in the yard ticked as they cooled, and the drawing on the wall held its four figures in permanent, imperfect stillness. Maddox Creed, who had buried his scars under decades of forward motion, who had built a brotherhood to replace the family he hadn't had, who had ridden for 23 years through the American desert looking for the thing that made the writing mean something, stood in his workshop in the late autumn light and felt the weight he'd been carrying for most of his life shift by some fraction, not gone, not healed, but different, reclassified. Not the weight of loss anymore, the weight of something to protect. He picked up his wrench and went back to work.